Yeah, so good afternoon, and thank you everyone for coming. I see some familiar faces in the audience, some classmates here, and even, yes, I've spotted a former professor, so hi, how are you guys doing? This is a talk primarily on, well, at its heart about energy policy, but that is a very, very big topic, obviously. So today we're actually focusing on one specific energy policy in a municipal context, which is the idea of pursuing 100% renewable energy for an entire community. And if you're thinking, that sounds hard, you're right. And that's mostly what this conversation is going to be about. In addition, we want to talk specifically about what that means for a town like Banff in the mountains, a small town, and also a small town in the mountains in Alberta. There are particularly unique and challenging obstacles in Alberta that I'll be discussing quite a bit. So yeah, what you'll hear, I'll give you a little information on what this Renewable Cities or 100% renewable energy thing is. 100% renewable energy cities call themselves Renewable Cities. Why Banff would ever think to target something like this. As I said, it's quite a big challenge. And then what those actual challenges are and how the town is going about confronting them. So that's why you're here. Why are we here? Well, we're here for a couple of different reasons. The 100% renewable energy conversation in Banff stretches all the way back to the end of 2014. And that was a time when there were two people, both named Karen, who came before the town council, and they said, Council, we want you to adopt this big goal, 100% renewable energy. And the main reason was to address climate change. And everybody in the administration went, oh my God, that's a really tall order. And council said the same thing. So they said to the administration, go away, come back to us with a roadmap and some ideas on how we might actually be able to achieve this. So fast forward a couple of years, in 2016, the town and the university got together and thought, well, maybe some students could help out with this. So in the end, I was actually a student at the end, it was just last year in 2017, that worked on a 100% renewable energy capstone project with the town. And there were two other students as well who did similar projects. Now they went off and did other things, but I stuck around. I thought, these guys need help. I want to stay on with them. So thank you to the Center for Corporate Sustainability for funding, in part, an internship for myself with the Town of Banff. And I did a little presentation at the end of that internship around Christmas last year, and I thought that was the end of it. And then I came back in January, and it turns out it was like a pebble starting an avalanche, and everyone wanted to do renewable energy things in the town. So I've turned this into a bit of a consulting gig, which is a bit of a lesson for students there. If you're really interested in something, you can turn it into a job for yourselves. So I've already mentioned some of these people, but I just want to extend thanks to Chad, who's been my boss and a mentor over the last year and a half. Shannon Ripley, who was covering for him for a while, she was very valuable in helping me get my project done. And of course to the center here, who have funded some of my work last fall and have helped get this talk going. And then Dr. Irene Hermans, whose office is in the building, but I don't think she was able to be here. She also helped fund some of the research on this topic. Okay, so a little bit of a ground level, let's just get the foundations down. Climate change is happening. Right now we're at a 1 degree Celsius temperature anomaly relative to pre-industrial times. And the models say that this is going to go up to 3 degrees Celsius potentially by the end of the century. Now, if that's true, then we probably need to be taking some action. And in Canada, actually, that warming, the evidence says, is occurring at roughly twice the global rate. So in Alberta, this is just the Alberta, or rather Calgary temperatures for the last 70 years, and you can see that we're actually at a 2 degrees Celsius anomaly. A lot of people think Alberta, the climate isn't changing, but actually it is. It's just too slow for most of us to see. And of course, only a couple months ago, there was this big warmest day in the history of the town, so in the history of the city. Now, who knows if that's really directly linkable to climate change, but it should at least be part of the conversation. There are much bigger warning signs: wildfires, droughts, stronger storms, but most notably sea level rise and the decline of the Arctic ice packs, or the Arctic sea ice. So these are pretty important climate impacts that are beginning to become more severe, and cities are starting to take notice. In particular, coastal cities. So this is just Miami and Shanghai. If we do get to that 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase by the end of the century, these cities, a couple of centuries after that, will be probably underwater for the most part. So climate impacts are a real driver for these cities to take climate action. Interestingly though, and ironically, cities are actually uniquely responsible for climate change, of course, as well. 70% approximately of all global emissions come from cities. And clearly transportation is a big issue. Even in China now, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have seen a scene like this, but now in Beijing and Shanghai and other Chinese cities, everybody wants a car. And fortunately, China is leading the way on electric cars, so it's not quite as big of an issue in China as it has been for us potentially. But of course, in Canada, a big factor for us is we actually have to heat all of our buildings. We have cold winters, so that's a very, very big factor in Canada's emissions, and of course, industrial emissions in Canada as well. Now, cities are also, fortunately, uniquely capable of addressing this challenge. And a big reason for that is because most people on the planet now live in cities. And what this means is that cities are now major centers for innovation, education, and finance. And fortunately, also cities do tend to be a little bit more progressive on the climate change issue. That's by no means a guarantee, but in a lot of cities this is probably the case. Fortunately also, urban centers and especially small towns like Banff are also very nimble, and they can implement projects and policies very quickly instead of waiting years or decades for the federal government or the provincial government to take those actions, although those are necessary as well. And because of the way we elect city councils, they do tend to be more nonpartisan. We don't elect parties into power in most of our municipalities. So that means that the conversations are a little more balanced, and there's no party whip that says, no, you can't vote that way, you have to vote this way. It's more of a conversation. And of course, in some municipalities, the leadership is a bit more stable too. So in Calgary, we have Ned Nenshi, he's been here for 3 terms, and in Banff, Karen Sorensen's been here for 3 terms. So this means that cities are starting to become, and have become, the climate action leaders globally. And this is a movement that has really taken off in the last 10 years. So there's a lot of organizations around this, but there's a couple of key ones. So the Global Covenant of Mayors is a very big one. Over 9,000 cities and towns now globally are members of this Global Covenant. And that's over 10% of the world's population. So these are cities that are dedicated to addressing climate change. The C40 Cities Group, that's really a whole bunch of mega cities. It's not really about towns and small municipalities. It's about the Londons, the New Yorks, the Sydneys, the Torontos, the Miamis, the Shanghais. All of these big cities are very, very concerned about this and are grouping up together. But the most recent, and I would argue the most interesting one that has emerged, the most interesting group, is this We Are Still In group in the United States. And again, this is kind of an informal collection of urban areas, cities, counties, 10 states that have reacted to the federal government's withdrawal or proposed withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. And now this big movement in the United States among cities, they really are leading that climate charge. A lot of people think the United States is not acting on climate change. That couldn't be farther from the truth. It's the federal government, perhaps, that isn't. Some federal agencies aren't, but the cities are absolutely leading the way. So the big question then is, why? And that's a very legitimate question, because if you take a poll of the average Canadian or the average American, climate change is not at the top of their concerns. Their concerns are about healthcare, about jobs, about the economy, about poverty, social security, things like that. You can see on this survey from Ipsos back in 2015, climate change was right at the very, very bottom. So why are these cities taking this on? How are they taking this on? And the answer for a lot of them is renewable energy. And the reason is that renewable energy doesn't just address climate change. It's a big movement now because it addresses all of those things that are at the top of people's concerns. So air quality, economics, jobs, growing business, energy security, energy costs for businesses and homeowners, social justice. A lot of places are very concerned about protecting people from the big bad energy company. This is a big concern in the United States. Energy independence is a huge issue as well. Probably the most famous 100% renewable energy city in America is Georgetown, Texas. The mayor was just up here a couple weeks ago for the Alberta Climate Conference. Texans are independent. They see themselves as being sort of apart from the rest of the United States, and they can do things independently, and they want to do that. And that was a major driver for adopting this target in Georgetown and other Texan municipalities. And a big one for mountain municipalities in particular, municipalities that are in kind of environmentally sensitive areas or that depend on ecological tourism, is that leadership piece, showing the world that we can do more. And that definitely applies in the case of the town of Banff. Okay, so I've mentioned this a couple times, 100% renewable energy. What is that really? Well, there's two parts. There's the 100%. I think everyone knows what 100% means. And then there's the renewable energy piece. And probably everyone here has a sense of what that is too. It's solar and hydro and wind and biomass and geothermal and waste to energy even in some cases. But when you put them together in a municipal context, what it is a gigantic commitment to transform how your community uses energy. And as I'll show later on, 95% of Banff's energy right now comes from non-renewables. So the scale of the problem is very, very big. There's no agency out there that looks after who's a member of this club. It's a very informal club. And to give you an idea, as I mentioned, that how quickly it's growing in the United States, there were 82 municipalities that had committed to 100% renewable energy about a month ago when I started working on this presentation, and now there's 88. Every time I go back and look, there's more, there's more, there's more. Typically when you see a graph like this, it's in years, but this is actually in quarters. So there's actually only 5 years on this plot, and it's just really, really taken off. So the United States is definitely a leader here. Hawaii has also committed to 100% renewable energy, I think maybe by 2035 or something like that for its electricity sector. And California just in September committed to 100% renewable energy by I think 2045. So this is, over 20% of the American population with this very aggressive goal. This isn't emissions targets, this is 100% renewable energy. Just to give you a sense of the map too, I talked about all these other issues that renewable energy helps address. This is a nonpartisan topic, increasingly, renewable energy. You can see on this map of those 88 municipalities, there are a lot of red states represented on this map. Georgia, Louisiana, Missouri, Florida, Oklahoma. These are red states, and they are still pumped up about this transition to 100% renewable energy. In Canada, it's a bit more muted. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it's harder for us. We have this big heating challenge. We have a colder climate. In the US, they have air conditioning, yes, but heating requires more energy. Also, we directly consume fossil fuels for heating. Electricity comes from a variety of sources, but we heat using natural gas. So committing to 100% renewable energy there is pretty tricky. The other reason is that we do tend to be a bit more dependent on the federal government. There's this sort of a Canadian mentality. Let the feds and the provinces deal with it. In the US, it's a bit more regional, so they're more likely to take independent action. And again, in the US, most of those goals, most of those municipalities have only committed to 100% renewable electricity, which although it does take care of their air conditioning, it doesn't take care of their heating, and it doesn't take care of their transportation. Globally, it's basically all the North American areas I just described, but also Europe used to be the leader on this. 10 years ago, there were no North American municipalities that had committed to this kind of goal. Now, in North America, this has really, really grown, and you don't hear too much from Europe anymore. I think we just assume Europe is addressing climate change, but in reality, I think there's still more they could do. And then a big notable area is in Oceania, where a lot of these small island countries are very, very concerned about this transition. And it's not necessarily about climate change for them, although they are concerned about sea level rise. A lot of those island countries are concerned about their dependence on imported diesel fuel. So getting into a segue here out of the high level stuff, mountain towns are uniquely swinging above their weight in this 100% renewable energy club. And the reason for that is twofold. There's the environmental leadership piece I described earlier, but then also they're quite concerned about the environmental, or rather the economic impacts of climate change and climate change. And a big part of this is snow, is the snowpack. It's the length of their ski season, or the length of their golf season, or how it will affect their tourism. So there are a lot of factors that are priorities for municipalities, but in the mountain towns, they have some unique ones. And one thing that's really crucial for municipalities is to figure out why you're doing this. It's a very big goal, 100% renewable energy. It's a very long-term goal. You better know why you're doing it. Otherwise, it's just another target set and not met. So that's my segue to Chad, who I'll invite up to talk about the town of Banff, some of its history and what it's doing to achieve this or start thinking about it.
Thank you, Michael, for both the introduction, but also for bringing a really fresh set of eyes to this. He's right, we started discussing it in 2015 as a council, and then they, to their credit, I think we have 7 council members, and I know them all personally. It is a very nimble organization compared to other governments, and the temptation with a goal like 100% renewable energy by 2050 is, sure, why not? Sounds good. I probably won't be around in 2050, and we'll let someone else deal with it. But to their credit, they didn't turn it down, and they asked us to think more about it before they committed to it. And so that's what we've been working on, especially since Michael has become involved, and we've got really into the details now of what the challenges will be for Banff. It sounds like a great commitment, and it sounds like a laudable objective, but there will be lots of challenges within that. And that's what I look to this audience, maybe with the last few slides that we have. What might you be able to offer us from your varied backgrounds in surmounting some of these challenges? Because the town of Banff is unique in some ways, but it's also another municipality that faces these issues. So we hope that we're the first of many within Canada to adopt this, and it helps some of the research that Michael has done with other mountain communities and others within Canada like Vancouver who have adopted this, not just for electricity, but also for heating and transportation, taking on all of these big challenges. So I'm going to assume that most of you have been to Banff at some point, and maybe frequently, and maybe for a while, maybe even worked in the ski industry or whatever. But so you have a sense of what we're about and who we host. Tourism is our only industry. Visitation has gone generally up, certainly since I've been there, and overall in the park for many, many years. We're now approaching 4.5 million visitors a year. So to a town the size of 4 square kilometers, that's a lot of people. Even within this introductory slide, Michael and I talked about the photograph that he chose. You see the tourism industry in its finest, a sweet shop, and people roaming Banff Avenue, having Cascade Mountain in the background, and yet that sweet shop has its doors wide open. It's not a summer day. And that's part of one of our challenges is the town is reliant on a tourism economy, and a lot of them come with the national park expectation, which is good, but they're also, the businesses rely on a lot of discretionary traffic who just decide to drop into a shop, and that's why this particular business decides to have their doors wide open despite the heating impacts. So Banff's unique in many respects. The town was only set up in 1990. I don't know if that's well known, but it's an island within the national park. You can read our specific objectives that were set out, but we're a service center to the wider national park, and we're our own independent municipality, but on almost everything we partner with Parks Canada. And so we both provide for 4.5 million visitors, but also for the residents that live there. And I think that most of you would recognize that it is a little different place when you come there. Not only the development footprint, the lower corner is that fixed development footprint. 4 square kilometers provides a whole lot of opportunities for something like sustainable transportation. It's a commitment that was hard, I'm sure, at the time. Some of you may remember that in 1998. And that in itself came with lots of challenges. We could have done a whole presentation just on that alone. But what that gives us now is the ability to work within just that footprint, and we don't just keep expanding and negating some of the environmental gains that we're making. So certainly when I'm doing something like the environmental master plan, energy is one part of it, but there's also coexistence with wildlife. There's air quality and ecosystems and waste, and all of these things link back in some ways to energy. And so that's been a great tying factor for us when we think of this commitment. It may be for some of the councillors about solely climate change, but I think for most of them it ticks a number of boxes, and leadership and energy independence are certainly high up there for them. So this fixed footprint is important to keep in mind because it allows us to, I think, host a lot more visitors, but control through various means our energy consumption. So that's one of the first steps I think we're going to need to get to, is at least stopping the increase. And we've been lucky that with water consumption, with electricity consumption, and even natural gas, we're flat or decreasing despite increasing visitation. And so that's an encouraging first step for us. I think we have a long ways to go in energy efficiency, don't get me wrong, but these are encouraging stats that we have. It's a good place to start from when we think of this challenge of 100% renewable energy. isn't going to be new generation facilities alone. It's certainly going to have to be reducing our load a whole lot in all of these areas. So, as I said before, there's a number of interrelated issues. It isn't just the light switch. It's energy and how it's generated for our community is related to air quality. It's related to water consumption. Two of our biggest energy consumers are, as a municipality, how we pump up water and how we treat it at the end, distribute it throughout the network. Those are our largest electricity and natural gas consumers as a municipality. So we achieve a lot on the water quality side, but we do that by using a whole lot of energy. And so that's one within the municipal sphere that we have to think about. Waste generation, as you can imagine, from 4.5 million visitors is high, and that's certainly part of our greenhouse gas inventory and footprint. So the climate impacts that we see locally, I'm sure you're not surprised about, but I think they're becoming increasingly well understood, that linkage between how we use energy, how we generate electricity and heating, and then how we see that. And so probably the most evident to many is the last two fire seasons have not been right around Banff, but we've certainly seen the impacts through almost all the month of August in both cases. And so when we think of the climate impacts, they're both ecosystem, and Parks Canada thinks a lot about that in terms of how this will affect the migration of species and where we can expect to see plants, animals, and how this affects maybe in terms of our aquifer recharge. That's the most basic good that the town supplies to visitors and residents, is that drinking water. So everything from the ski season to the dry summer and fire season and flooding, of course, in 2013, all relevant considerations for this mountain town. Ecosystems being displaced is just one of the considerations when we think about the effects of climate change on a mountain town like Banff. So I'll point out a few projects, but the municipality should be the ones taking the lead, and I hope that we are. We've put solar panels on 4 different buildings. One of those slides is almost 1,000 panels on our arena, and so now we're generating a share of our electricity, but that solar panels alone won't solve this problem. We're proud of some of these projects, certainly, and proud of this project too, is that I think municipalities putting solar panels or renewable energy on their own buildings isn't all that unique. But we thought a lot about how do we get this out to the wider community, and through sort of charging rent on our streets and sidewalks, we've established an environmental reserve and are giving that back out in terms of incentives and rebates for, we now have about 30 properties, residences and hotels that have put solar panels on their own roofs, and we've helped them get there. So that's a small chunk, but we really want that to keep growing and want to be part of that and try and think about the barriers to any of these places, both getting better at how they use energy, but also doing their own renewables. So this is one that has been picked up by a lot of organizations within our town. And so 30 doesn't sound like a lot, but we only have about 3,000 buildings. So we also are looking ahead with projects like a biomass district heating facility. We don't have a whole lot of biomass, but what we do is have a whole lot of pallets. Things arrive into Banff, a lot of liquor arrives into Banff, and it all comes on a pallet that nobody takes back. So wood is one product that we have that we could conceivably use to heat some of our buildings. And when we think about buildings now, municipal buildings, we think about how can they generate their own energy. And when we think about a net zero transit garage, if we build that building, we're thinking about how it cannot contribute to our greenhouse gas footprint. When we think about moving people around, we've even talked about aerial transit, not just to the ski hills, but throughout the community, and how we get people from Calgary out. And that's a big part of our visitation. And many people used to come by train, and now they come by in vehicles, and we're even thinking of bringing the train back. So all of these are conceptual projects at this point, but all part of that picture. Transportation, buildings are all part of our energy picture. We're within our own fleet. We bought Canada's first fleet of hybrid buses a number of years ago, 4, but a fleet nonetheless. That fleet has now been grown to go out to Lake Louise and to some of the major attractions. So transit is going to be a big part of how we see ourselves moving around in the future. As a municipality, our fire department now has a full electric vehicle, and so does our operations department. So I'll turn it back to Michael because he's really been concentrating on how can we make this global movement, North American movement, apply to Banff and how do we think about the specifics, and this diagram gives you a sense of the complexity.
Thank you, Chad. I just learned something. I've been working on the biomass project for a while now. I didn't know we were heating the town with booze, ultimately, so that's very interesting. So keep drinking, I guess. And Chad's too modest, I think, about the solar piece. It's very much his baby, and in 3 years, Banff has gone from having 0 solar to now generating fully 1% of the town's electricity with solar. And I know 1% doesn't sound like much, but this is definitely a 1% at a time problem for every municipality. So I kind of like to hitch onto that a bit. All right, so our real objective over the next 8 months, which is the duration of our new planning project, the Renewable Energy Transition Plan, is to try and understand what this problem looks like, how we can achieve it, and then how we can come up with a plan to do that. And the starting point is to understand how the community uses energy. That's a very complicated thing to understand. This is just a web from our consultant's website showing how they need to put various pieces of energy data together to understand that community energy challenge, just to understand where you're starting from. And it is quite tricky. Fortunately, there is actually a standard approach for this type of project. So there are really 3 phases to the project we're taking on right now. The first is to come up with a baseline of our energy and our emissions in the community. It's a lot, by the way. It's something like 3 million gigajoules or something like that. It's a huge amount of energy, even for a small town. And then once we have that baseline, then you can start thinking about setting targets and then developing a plan to achieve those targets. There's a bit of a chicken and the egg here. Sometimes you want to know what you're proposing to do before you set the target, but this is the general approach. Once this project is done, we'll have an initial plan, an initial roadmap on how to achieve this. And who knows what the actual targets will be. Maybe it'll be 100% for electricity by 2050, or maybe it'll be 100% for just the corporate electricity by 2030 or something like that. There's a lot of nuance to this that needs to be worked out, and that's what this project is about. There are thousands of municipalities that have done projects like this. A few of the things that make ours a bit unique, aside from just being in the town of Banff and being in association with this 100% target, is the fact that the consultant we've hired has a very sophisticated modeling package. It's not just spreadsheets. It allows them to look at the entire community's energy consumption and emissions as a moving system, so that if you change one thing, everything else will change in response. So for example, of all of your buildings, if you assume they're all going to get 50% more efficient, well, that will automatically depress the economics of a district heating system, for example. So the interactions between these things are very important. One of the very valuable things that comes out of that kind of detailed study is costs. This is going to be a fully costed plan that will transition the town to whatever target we ultimately set. It could be 100% renewable energy for the entire community. This is a really key metric, dollars per ton. If you're going to do this, you need to be able to persuade people that it's not going to steal all their money. The cost of avoiding these emissions is very, very critical. So I already mentioned the starting point, and it's a bit daunting for sure. And this is not unique to Banff. Every Alberta municipality is starting at something like this, 95%-ish renewable energy. When you look at gasoline, which is most of our cars, natural gas, which is most of our heating, and electricity, 90% of which comes from coal and natural gas, this is the number you get. So it's a big, big challenge. To describe that in a little bit more detail, this is the energy consumption of Banff. As far as I've been able to calculate it, we don't have good data on transportation. So electricity in the blue here, natural gas is about 3 times as much, but because the grid in Alberta is so dirty, it actually is less emissions from gas than it is from electricity. And of course, this huge transportation quantity. And there's been a lot of conversation about electrification. Well, what does that mean? Well, electrification is a way of getting rid of gas for heating and a way of getting rid of gasoline for transportation. But that energy still has to come from somewhere. You got to move a car, heat a house, and if it's going to come from electricity, there's this big question mark. Well, what does that mean for emissions? There's way more questions than that. How do we actually produce that much electricity using renewables? But also, what are the emissions going to be in the next few decades as this transition happens? Full electrification in Alberta does not equate to a reduction in emissions right now. So that's going to lead me to our last few slides here, where I'm going to go through what I think are the key challenges for us. And if you work for a municipality or you're thinking about working for a municipality on something like this, you're going to face the same challenges, because again, most of these aren't unique to Banff. So the first one is the Alberta grid. We have the dirtiest grid in the country. There are good things about that. We have also some of the cheapest electricity in the country. We have a very reliable grid. We have very dispatchable electricity. So if we have a plant go down, we can bring another plant up quite quickly. But this is the cost. It's an environmental cost. And a town like Banff doesn't have too many options. Any town in Alberta doesn't have too many options. There are really three. The grid either gets better, which is what the government's trying to do now, or we can go completely around the grid and get our electricity from specific areas that we want. But that's really hard because we don't own our own municipal utility. The town can buy its own electricity. But what do you do about Joe business or residents in the town? They can decide where they get their electricity. So it's not easy to go around the grid unless you live in Medicine Hat or something where you own your own municipal electric utility. And the third option, of course, is to build local renewables. But challenge number two is that's only going to get you so far. In a town like Banff, especially, where we're in the mountains, surrounded by a national park, we don't have a big empty field to build a huge solar farm. We don't have a big empty field to put up enormous wind turbines. Can you imagine Banff looking something like this, where there are 400-foot wind turbines spilled throughout the Bow Valley? It doesn't seem very likely. There's also some geothermal potential in Banff, but can you envision there being a gigantic geothermal plant? Maybe, but it doesn't seem very likely in the short term. So where do you get this energy? Challenge number three, there's 6, just so you're not antsy. Challenge number 3 is this gas heating problem. And clearly it's a building efficiency piece. We need to have more efficient buildings. But if we can't build a new building, we have to retrofit that building. And where does that money come from? How do we persuade people to put their buildings on hold so that they can be retrofitted? And of course, electrification is a piece. Heat pumps are basically the solution to electrification. There are a lot of provinces and states that have huge incentives to adopt heat pumps, air source heat pumps, geothermal heat pumps, things like that. But again, in Alberta, the grid is so dirty, you don't have that emissions reduction that you would in Ontario or BC. If you live in BC, go buy an electric car. Your emissions will drop. If you live in BC, go buy a heat pump. Your emissions will drop. They'll drop from, an enormous amount from gasoline and natural gas to almost zero because it's all hydro in BC. We don't have that situation here in Alberta. Big challenge number 4, visitor transportation. So Chad talked about this quite a bit. This is a typical Saturday morning, mid-morning in the middle of the summer on a nice day. And when I'm commuting out to Banff as a consultant in the summer, I don't want to encounter this. So it's a little bit of a nitpick for me. Most of the North American visitors that come to Banff have their own vehicles and they want to be able to use them in the town. But we don't really want them to use them in the town. We want them to get around in other ways. We want to build a community that's focused on pedestrian movement and a visitor experience as well that doesn't involve sitting in traffic. So electric vehicles are obviously important to that, but the uptake rate for electric vehicles is not going to be 100% in the next 10 years. It's going to be a slow transition over decades. So we want to see things happen a little faster. And so that's all about that mode shift. Chad mentioned we have this very steadily rising tourism numbers. Over 4 million people a year now. I think you said 4.5 million people. That's an astonishing number of people. I still can't get my head around that. I kind of go into the town and wonder, where are they all going? I don't know. They're all there though. And it can be very, very crowded even in mid-October in what used to be off-season, but is now just kind of a slightly slower season. So how do you persuade businesses to forego revenues in favor of going and closing their hotel for 6 months to retrofit a bunch of buildings? Surely it's possible because I think they'll do it for tourist reasons. The Rocky Mountain Resort where I often stay, all of their buildings are under retrofit right now. So people, hotels do this, but we have to synchronize that retrofit priority with their visitor experience priority and get the timing lined up so that these things happen simultaneously, but it's not easy. The big final one, which some of you I'm sure have anticipated, is the cost. Chad and I were speaking with Sarah in an interview before this presentation, and he said, one of the key things people have to know, council has to know, is that the cleaner option will cost more, because the dirty options, we're not incorporating those externalities. We're not making people pay for pollution. We're not making people pay for greenhouse gas emissions right now. You're getting all that pollution at zero cost. We're paying the price socially and environmentally, but we're not paying the price financially. Bridgewater, Nova Scotia did a very similar study just last year, same consultant firm actually as we have. And the projected cost for 32 years was $400 million. And we're getting used to seeing big numbers, but this is a town of 8,000 people. $400 million is a pretty epic cost. So where's that money going to come from? Well, it could come from higher taxes, higher user fees, a higher cost of living as businesses pass on their costs to consumers. But a lot of this investment could come from the private sector. There is a lot of capital out there begging to be deployed in energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And small municipalities like Banff need to start taking advantage of that capital, tapping into that capital. For Banff, this sounds like a huge number. Maybe it'll be something like this. But there's 4 million visitors a year. 400 million, that's 100 million divided by 30, divided by 30. It ends up being about $2 extra per visitor, per visit. And you paid for this. So actually Banff has a huge lever it can pull, which is this tourism lever. And it wouldn't be that hard to get this money. We just need to have the political will, not locally necessarily, but also federally, to charge that fee. So this is the last slide, and Chad and I are both very interested in hearing your questions and getting an idea of what you guys think we should do, because it's not set in stone. What targets would you adopt? And remember, there are hundreds of municipalities now that have adopted very aggressive 100% targets. So don't feel like you're crazy or we're crazy for thinking about it. It's probably going to happen, but is it going to happen by 2050 or is it going to happen by 2300? And these are the big questions we have. What about electricity? Where is it going to come from? What can we realistically commit to? What about heating? Where is that money going to come from? And what about transportation? How do we get people out of their cars and get them to Banff in a way that isn't contributing to this problem? That's a big issue for the town of Banff. It's supposed to be a model environmental community. I think in a lot of ways it is. But because of the tourism industry, it's one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters on a per capita basis around. So these are important issues that we're trying to struggle with. So thank you very, very much for listening. And by all means, jump in and challenge some of the things I've said or make some suggestions.
My question is this. Parks Canada and your utility companies, what are they doing to help?
That's a uniquely placed question. Doug Layton was the former manager of planning and development for the town of Banff, so he knows what he's talking about when he asks the question. Parks Canada is a very big organization, and I think it's hopeful for us that they're now within the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change under Minister McKenna in Ottawa. And so combining those two into who gives direction to Parks Canada is hopeful. But haven't seen a whole lot of that within the National Park Administration that we're part of right now. That said, I think that we're all, as a council, hopeful that in some cases, with the relationship that's been created in Banff, and Doug would know this well, that sometimes it's parks pushing the town and sometimes the town's pushing the park. And with respect to renewable energy, I think we're going to be pushing the park. And that's my personal view. A lot of these are, as opposed to necessarily a view of council. But on this one, a lot of who they have put in positions of authority within the national park or about ecosystem conservation and about visitor experience, and energy has not been a priority for them. That said, they have a commitment for 10% reduction in greenhouse gases in their own operations countrywide. How that plays out in Banff National Park, even when we talk about geothermal, very early exploration, field research, it's a touchy subject with Parks Canada, and I'm sure it would be in any protected area. So utility companies haven't been involved yet, Doug, and I hope that they will be, and I hope that we're able to partner with them. Certainly in creating a lot of our rebate programs and an environmental reserve that I'm doling out for people's solar panels, that's done in conjunction with the distributor, Fortis. They're not sponsoring it, but they're enabling us to create money that isn't coming from property taxes for me to be able to give out back to people to do the right thing that we want them to do with regard to energy. So I hope, and that's, I think, Michael's challenges slides at the end, motivations of all kinds of people will be required, and they won't all be the same. So we're gonna have to constantly look for places where our ends meet. With utility companies, I'm hoping that they either want to or have to work with us on this one.
I saw in your presentation a number of other municipalities. You mentioned California and Hawaii committing to targets in 2030s or 2040s. And my question is, how long do you think we have for this? How long do you think we have before, say, there isn't a Banff to ski in?
I was kind of expecting a question like that. It's a very good question. I don't know. No, I'll say more than that. It really depends on who you talk to. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist. I read the same articles and watch the same blogs as everybody else does. So there's a lot of conversation about how quickly we have to act. If you listen to the IPCC, who just earlier this month published their 1.5 degrees Celsius special report, they say we have to act very, very fast on this. I forget the exact wording. It's hard to get a decent quote out of a dull IPCC report if you want to go and read an IPCC report. But clearly they want us to act very quickly. As Chad mentioned, we're starting to see those impacts. With respect to things like the ski season, which is very important to me personally, skiing's fine now. So go out this year and buy your season pass. But in towns like Aspen, further south in the Rockies, 10 to 15 years ago, they started talking about 100% renewable energy, and the economic impact of climate change on the ski season there was a major driver in them adopting 100% renewable energy. So we're lucky because we're further north. But maybe it'll become clear in time how long we really have.
I had a question. You touched briefly on the kind of large indeterminate problem that you have, that you've got all these variables, all these indicators that you're trying to address at once. And you mentioned kind of briefly that you have a consultant or some software that they're using to try and develop what those interplays were. Your example about, I forget what the example was, but I'm just... District heating, that's right. So I'm just curious if you could just quickly expand on how you are trying to tackle all of these kind of problems all at once, how you're trying to develop their interplays or interconnectivities, how you're tackling this kind of wicked design problem.
Yeah, that's why we hired the really high-priced consultants to do that for us. Well, it's interesting if you look at. So that was my joking but also serious answer. If you look at almost any community energy plan, because just Google community energy plan, hundreds of them out there. Typically what they are is a giant list of actions. And some of those actions are really dull, like start a rideshare program. And some of them are just gigantic, like municipalize the electricity system or retrofit every single building by 2050. And I think that's one of our big challenges is we have so many actions that we need to do, and we can expect that anyway to come out of this project. How are we going to tackle them? So yeah, we don't really have the answer. This project doesn't take on the implementation piece. Right now it's all about understanding how we're using energy and then to start coming up with ideas. Once we're done, then it'll be, all right, now how do we actually fund these, plan these, do the groundwork, get the stakeholder engagement going, get support for them. So yeah, I don't have a very clear answer other than that it's going to be hard. Yeah.
I'll just add to that answer that we were lucky to get 85% funding for this study. So we have a pretty big pot of money to work with, and we've hired a consultant called SSG. Federation of Canadian Municipalities is sponsoring this project. So all of those things municipal governments like. Money coming from elsewhere to do a big study and plan. But we know, and they know, all of our councillors know that there are big implementation challenges ahead, and money, investments will be required, and probably some policies that will annoy people. And that's the reality, and that's what they're up for that challenge. Michael had a good analogy when part of the interview earlier today that say to any other community that you'd put fixed footprint, that Calgary can't get any bigger. This is as big as you can get higher, but you can't get any larger. That's a big challenge. It almost seems impossible. say that to Okotoks or to Airdrie or whatever. This is your fixed point for it. You only get 4 square kilometers. And so that's what was given to Banff, and yeah, it has been hard, but it certainly hasn't been the ruination of the town. We can work with challenges and we can achieve them.